Deep underground, hundreds of feet below the sunlit surface, a man named Arthur swung his pickaxe into the solid wall of coal, inhaling a thick, invisible cloud of pulverized rock with every desperate breath. The air inside the narrow, pitch-black tunnel was so heavy with dust that the beam from his headlamp could barely pierce the gloom, leaving him to work in a suffocating haze. When his 12-hour shift finally ended, he did not emerge into the fresh air with relief, but collapsed near the mine entrance, his chest heaving as he coughed up handfuls of thick, black sludge. This was the terrifying daily reality for tens of thousands of men who vanished into the Appalachian mountainside, trading their oxygen for a meager paycheck. The dust coated their skin, filled their ears, and settled deep into their throats, creating a constant burning sensation that no amount of water could wash away. Night after night, these men lay awake in their small wooden company houses, listening to the terrifying wheeze in their own chests, realizing slowly that the very mountain they were hollowing out was now burying them from the inside. That agonizing struggle for a single, clean breath was not a tragic accident of nature, but the calculated byproduct of an industrial machine designed to extract maximum profit at any human cost. Far removed from the soot and the suffering, sitting behind heavy mahogany doors in pristine boardrooms, was the Mellon family, one of the wealthiest and most untouchable financial dynasties in American history. While the public knew them as aristocratic bankers and generous philanthropists who funded grand museums and universities, their true empire was built on a sprawling, hidden network of heavy industry. They did not just lend money, they owned the mines, the railroads, and the massive corporations that dictated the daily lives of countless working families across the country. Through their vast web of holding companies, the Mellons held absolute control over Consolidation Coal, an industrial titan that dominated the energy landscape. The decisions made by the Mellon bankers in their quiet, sterile offices instantly became the brutal laws of the underground, dictating the pace of the machines, the length of the shifts, and the absolute lack of safety gear provided to the men in the dark. They possessed a level of corporate power so absolute that they could shape the American economy, write their own regulations, and silence anyone who dared to question their methods. This immense financial shield allowed the dynasty to operate with total impunity, insulating their pristine public image from the devastating physical toll their coal empire extracted from its workers. When the devastating physical toll finally caught up with the miners, they were met with one of the most chilling medical deceptions ever orchestrated by corporate power. A miner, his face pale and his lungs rattling with every shallow breath, would drag himself into the company doctor's office, desperate for help and a reason for his agony. Instead of receiving treatment, the man sitting across the desk, a physician paid directly by the coal company, would look him in the eye and tell him that his lungs were perfectly fine. These doctors went even further, looking at men who were actively suffocating to death and telling them that inhaling coal dust was actually harmless, or incredibly, that it was good for their health. They claimed the black dust coated the lungs and protected them from other diseases, dismissing the men's terrifying symptoms as simple asthma, a common cold, or a weakness of character. The sick miners were sent right back down into the suffocating tunnels, completely abandoned by the medical professionals they trusted to save their lives. Behind the closed doors of those clinics, the doctors knew exactly what the dust was doing, because the physical destruction caused by black lung disease is both brutal and irreversible. As a miner breathes in the contaminated air, tiny microscopic pieces of coal dust, sharp as shattered glass, travel down the windpipe and lodge themselves deep inside the delicate air sacs of the lungs. The human body, unable to dissolve or cough up these jagged particles, goes into a state of constant, frantic defense, attacking the dust and creating thick, rigid scar tissue in the process. Over years and decades, this unrelenting cycle of injury and scarring transforms healthy, flexible lung tissue into a stiff, blackened mass that can no longer expand or absorb oxygen. The victim is slowly robbed of the ability to breathe, their heart straining harder and harder to pump blood through the ruined tissue until their organs simply begin to fail. It is a slow, agonizing suffocation that takes years to complete, turning the simple act of taking a breath into a desperate, exhausting battle for survival. The irreversible scarring left these men gasping for every breath, transforming strong laborers into invalids who could no longer swing a pickaxe or carry a load, forcing them to seek the medical help they were promised. Stripped of their physical strength and their livelihoods, they had only one place left to turn for survival. Picture a father in his late 40s, his face pale and his chest heaving, sitting across a cold wooden desk from a company claims adjuster. He holds a stack of unpaid bills and doctor notes, pleading for the worker compensation he was guaranteed when he took the job underground. His children are going hungry, his savings are completely gone, and he simply cannot return to the dark, suffocating tunnels to earn a wage. But the adjuster does not look up with sympathy or offer a lifeline to the desperate man. Instead, he slides a stamped piece of paper across the desk, a formal letter stating that the miner's breathing problems are due to asthma or smoking or simply bad genetics. The claim is completely denied, leaving the family to face absolute ruin while the company protects its bottom line. That crushing denial letter was not a mistake made by a careless clerk, but a weapon forged by a massive corporate machine. Behind closed doors, executives were quietly building an entire legal and medical defense system designed to reject every single claim that crossed their desks. Consolidation Coal, driven by the vast financial demands of the Mellon Empire, developed a ruthless, step-by-step playbook to ensure they never paid a dime for the disease they caused. When a miner fell ill, the company internal medical department would immediately take control of his health files, locking away the true diagnosis in secure filing cabinets. Crucial chest X-rays that clearly showed the dark, cloudy masses of black lung would conveniently go missing just days before a compensation hearing. To replace the missing evidence, the coal operators hired highly paid outside medical experts, doctors who would take the stand and swear under oath that coal dust was entirely harmless to the human body. The sterile, brightly lit courtrooms where these hired doctors testified stood in sharp, cruel contrast to the dark, dust-choked tunnels where the miners were actually dying. But the company soon realized that fighting claims in court was still too risky, leading them to devise an even darker strategy to eliminate the problem before it ever reached a judge. The most chilling tactic in their arsenal was a policy of preemptive termination. Foremen and supervisors were ordered to watch their crews closely, listening for the deep, rattling cough that signaled the early stages of the disease. The moment a worker showed visible signs of struggling to breathe, he was quietly pulled aside at the end of his shift and fired on the spot. The logic behind this cruelty was strictly financial and perfectly legal under the twisted rules of the time. By terminating the miner before he could be officially examined and diagnosed by a company doctor, Consolidation Coal severed all legal ties, ensuring the sick man could never file a compensation claim against them. The Mellon family role in this dark saga went far beyond simply owning the mines and ignoring the sick. They used their immense, seemingly endless banking wealth to actively shape the laws of industrial health, funding political campaigns and quietly pressuring local governments to write regulations that favored corporate profits over human lives. The reach of the Mellon dynasty extended far beyond the dark tunnels of the mines, stretching directly into the halls of state legislatures and local courthouses. They used their immense financial power to systematically rewrite the rules of industrial health, ensuring that the legal definition of occupational disease excluded the very dust that was killing their workforce. By funding political campaigns and placing sympathetic judges on the bench, the company guaranteed that any miner brave enough to file a lawsuit would face a legal system engineered to protect corporate profits over human lungs. State medical boards, heavily influenced by industry money, were pressured to certify company-backed doctors who would testify under oath that coal dust was entirely harmless. This total capture of the legal system left sick and dying workers entirely defenseless against the corporate machine. Without a fair court to hear their pleas, families simply watched their fathers and husbands wither away on front porches, coughing up black fluid, while the company that destroyed them continued to report record-breaking quarterly earnings. Looking back at this era of unchecked power, one is forced to confront the deeply unsettling psychology of the executives who orchestrated this massive deception. These were men of high society, celebrated philanthropists who built art galleries and funded universities, yet they governed an empire built on the shattered lungs of the working class. It begs a chilling question about the nature of corporate detachment. How did these industry titans sleep peacefully in their quiet, lavish mansions, fully aware that thousands of men in their employ were slowly suffocating in the dark? The answer lies in a terrifying ability to distance themselves from the human cost of their wealth. To the men sitting in pristine boardrooms hundreds of miles away from the Appalachian coal fields, the miners were not fathers, brothers, or sons. They were simply numbers on a ledger, expendable assets whose inevitable physical decline was factored into the daily cost of doing business. The vast physical distance between the opulent Mellon estates and the choking dust of the coal face created a moral vacuum, allowing these leaders to sign off on policies of denial without ever having to look a dying man in the eye. That profound executive silence echoed loudly through the decades, leaving a devastating mark on mining communities that still resonates today. In 1968, when the Farmington mine disaster in West Virginia finally forced the nation to look at the horrors of the coal industry, the true scale of the quiet suffering became impossible to ignore. The families left behind were not just mourning the victims of a sudden explosion, but the countless others who had been silently drowning in their own ruined lungs for years, abandoned by the wealthy men who had promised them a livelihood. As investigators and historians later sifted through the archives of Consolidation Coal, a horrifying truth emerged from the dust-covered documents. The denial of black lung was never a tragic accident of history, nor was it the result of a lack of medical knowledge during that era. The executives and company doctors knew exactly what the coal dust was doing to human tissue, having seen the blackened, scarred lungs in countless autopsies. The refusal to acknowledge the disease was a calculated, cold-blooded financial equation designed to avoid paying out millions of dollars in disability and death benefits. Actuaries and financial officers had run the numbers, realizing that acknowledging the true cause of the miners' suffering would bankrupt their workers' compensation funds and severely cut into the dynasty's profit margins. So, they made a deliberate choice to lie. They decided it was cheaper to fund massive public relations campaigns claiming coal dust was safe, to hire lawyers to fight every single medical claim, and to simply let the workers die rather than admit liability. It was a systematic monetization of human life, where the slow death of a workforce was deemed an acceptable price for industrial dominance. This ruthless financial calculus transformed a preventable occupational hazard into a generational slaughter. The realization that their suffering was a line item on a corporate budget ignited a fierce, desperate anger among the surviving miners, pushing them toward a historic breaking point. The legacy of this massive deception eventually forced a seismic shift in American labor law, forever altering the landscape of industrial safety. Driven by wildcat strikes and the undeniable physical evidence of a dying workforce, the federal government was finally compelled to pass the Federal Coal Mine Health and Safety Act of 1969. This landmark legislation established the first mandatory limits on respirable coal dust in the mines, a direct legal countermeasure to the decades of unchecked corporate negligence. Furthermore, the law created the Federal Black Lung Benefits Program, an institutional mechanism designed to finally compensate the victims that the coal barons had tried so desperately to erase. While no amount of money could restore a ruined breath or bring back a suffocated father, these policies stood as a permanent, undeniable indictment of the Mellon dynasty's hidden empire. The very existence of these federal programs serves as a lasting monument to the thousands of men who were sacrificed to the dark, and a stark reminder of the devastating human cost of corporate greed. The legacy of this denial was not merely recorded in corporate ledgers, but etched deeply into the very fabric of Appalachian mining towns. Entire generations of families found themselves trapped in a brutal cycle of medical bankruptcy and physical decline. When a miner lost his ability to breathe, he inevitably lost his job, and the financial collapse of his household was absolute and immediate. Widows were left behind to navigate a labyrinth of legal appeals for compensation that almost never arrived. They held on to stacks of denial letters, signed by company doctors who insisted their husbands had perished from anything other than the coal dust that coated their lungs. The immense wealth accumulated by the Mellon dynasty in distant gilded boardrooms was directly subsidized by the uncompensated suffering of these workers, leaving a lasting scar of poverty across the region. The aftershock of this calculated denial finally fractured the industry's shield in 1969. Driven by wildcat strikes across West Virginia and the undeniable accumulation of ruined lungs, the federal government passed the Coal Mine Health and Safety Act. This legislation forcefully overturned decades of corporate doctrine, legally recognizing black lung as a compensable occupational disease for the first time. The very medical files and form denial letters that company doctors had weaponized to dismiss sick miners were suddenly subpoenaed, transformed from instruments of corporate defense into undeniable proof of a systemic, deadly cover-up. Yet, long after the gavels fell and the corporate ledgers were closed, the true cost of this deception remained etched into the quiet homes of the coal camps. A single, crisp denial letter bearing the stamp of a company doctor often sat on a worn kitchen table, resting beside a humming oxygen tank. It stands as a chilling monument to a dynasty's ruthless math, a quiet and enduring reminder that immense fortunes were carefully assembled by stealing the very breath from the men who pulled that wealth from the dark.